Two barefoot girls, standing alone in the middle of the highway. When help finally came, it looked nothing like trust. On the loneliest stretch of a Wisconsin highway, a battered cruiser halted beneath the sinking November sun. Two girls, barefoot shivering, stood in the center of the empty road, their trust shattered long before help arrived. Beside them, a wounded dog and a weary cop, both carrying scars too deep for words. What unfolded next was not a rescue, but the slow, quiet work of finding hope after all faith is lost. Stay. This is the story of how healing begins, one silent act of kindness at a time. Late afternoon in winter spring Wisconsin. The sun had already slid behind the skeletons of birch and oak, its last golden warmth dissolving into the heavy blue of approaching evening. A thin mist crept along the ditches where the first real frost had settled overnight, whitening the edges of brittle weeds and the empty shells of thistle. There was a hush over everything, as if the world itself were pausing to take a careful breath before winter's true arrival. Tom Granger drove slow, both hands loose on the wheel, his right foot moving gently between brake and gas. Never in a hurry on these old county roads. The patrol car's heater pushed out a faint stream of warmth that fogged the lower corners of the windshield, but Tom didn't mind the chill. He preferred it sometimes, the way it could numb an old ache, especially the deep, persistent pulse in his right leg, the one that never fully faded since the accident. He wore his uniform lightly, a faded blue shirt, badge dulled at the corners, sleeves rolled just above the wrist where the scars were lighter, almost gone. Beside him, in the passenger seat, Banner lay curled on the thick canvas mat that had once been his office in another life. The German shepherd looked every bit the retired professional, ears notched, muzzle flecked with gray, his broad chest moving in slow, steady breaths. The scars on his left shoulder were hidden beneath fur, but Tom sometimes caught the way Banner would favor that side, especially on colder days. They were a matched set, he and the dog, both once needed, now mostly overlooked, surviving on memory and habit, driving these quiet stretches of highway in the long, slow hours when nothing much happened. Outside, the world passed by in a blur of brown fields and the dark, skeletal forms of trees standing guard along the horizon. Every so often, a single leaf would blow against the windshield, pause in the eddy of air, then skate away. Tom watched each one go, thinking, if he let himself think at all, about how November had a way of stripping everything down to its bones. The year's last colors clung to a few stubborn maples, but even they seemed to shiver, waiting for what would come next. He reached for the old thermos wedged between the seats, unscrewed the top, and sipped lukewarm coffee. Banner's ears flicked at the faint sound. Tom glanced down, smiled without showing teeth, and set the thermos back in place. The silence between them was companionable. No need for words, no need for comfort, just the shared presence of two living things who knew loss and routine in equal measure. They rolled past the old water tower, its faded letters barely legible now, then the rusted mailbox at the turnoff for Dairy Road. Tom flicked his gaze to the rearview mirror more out of habit than suspicion. There was no one behind them. Winter Spring was not a place for trouble, at least not the kind that came with lights and sirens. As they crossed the bridge over Miller Creek, Banner shifted, just slightly, nose lifting, his entire posture tightening in a way that Tom could feel before he could see. The patrol car slowed of its own accord, tires hushing on damp pavement. Tom's right hand hovered over the gear shift, old nerves waking up. He followed Banner's gaze, out to the tree line ahead, where the mist had thickened, pooling low across the two-lane highway. A single crow burst from the brush, flapping ragged across the gray sky. But Banner didn't flinch. His eyes were locked, not on movement, but on something further down the road. Tom let the car roll to a stop at the shoulder, engine idling quietly, the heater fan clicking as it cycled off. For a long moment, neither man nor dog moved. There was only the hush of the engine, the wind sifting through dead grass, and the almost imperceptible tremor in the air, the way it feels when a storm is coming, even if the sky is clear. Banner stood, slow and deliberate, pressing his nose to the gap in the window where the cold leaked through. Tom reached for the radio, paused, then let his hand drop. Sometimes you just knew to wait. He turned off the engine. The world snapped into sharper focus. He could hear Banner's breathing, the faint click of his claws on the mat, the ticking of the engine as it cooled. Tom opened the door and stepped out, feeling the bite of cold through his uniform. He winced as his bad leg adjusted to the uneven gravel, then stretched carefully. Banner waited until Tom circled around the hood, then hopped down onto the road, fluid if a touch slower than in years past. Together they stood side by side, squinting into the hush. The road ahead shimmered with the last vestiges of daylight, all golds and muted blues, and beyond that, nothing but the empty sweep of country and the low, mournful cry of wind. There was a sense in that moment of being utterly alone. Not the kind of alone that hurts, but the kind that comes after you've learned not to expect anything from the world. Tom watched Banner's posture, ears forward, tail still, body tense but not afraid. A creature who has known both kindness and cruelty, and is waiting to see which will arrive next. Tom's own face softened, the lines at his eyes deepening. He reached down, fingers brushing through the thick fur behind Banner's ear, a wordless gesture, a check-in, a reassurance as much for himself as for the dog. Banner blinked slowly, then resumed his silent vigil on the misty horizon. The silence held. Out here, that was the language they both trusted. Not hope, not anticipation, just the readiness to face what might come, together. And in that hush, Tom thought of all the people who had learned not to trust, not to believe in the promise of help. He thought of how some wounds are quieter than others, and how sometimes the only thing you can do is wait for the next sign, a shift in the air, a single silent call for help that only a dog might hear. The mist thickened, swallowing sound and distance, until the only things left were breath, memory, and the shared resolve not to turn away. For Tom and Banner, it was enough. For now. They saw the girls before they heard them. Out of the low mist ahead, two small figures took shape. Standing in the center of Highway 7, side by side, facing the patrol car's headlights, as if neither surprised nor afraid, only lost. The world around them was still. Even the air held its breath. Tom froze, one hand on Banner's back, the other unconsciously moving to the radio at his hip. But he didn't press the button. There was something about the way the girls stood, utterly still, barefoot, shivering in the wind, that made him feel as if a single loud sound would scatter them like deer at the edge of a field. The two were unmistakably twins, no more than 6 or 7 years old. Their hair, once a sunlit gold, was now a tangled mess that caught the faintest light and made it glow. Each wore a thin cotton dress, one in faded blue, the other yellow, hem and sleeve muddied, torn, as if they'd crawled through the underbrush to arrive here. Their bare feet pressed into the cold pavement, toes curling against the grit and broken glass. One of the girls, blue dress, held the other's hand in a grip so tight her knuckles whitened. Her lips quivered, her chin tucked, but she didn't look away from Banner. There was no question in her gaze, only the cautious, wild hope that sometimes appears in children who have already survived too much. Her twin blinked slow, eyes rimmed red, a streak of dirt down one cheek. Tom's first instinct was to speak, to reach out with words as he'd been trained, but he stopped himself. Instead, he lowered his body, sinking to one knee, his bad leg stiff with protest, but making the effort to appear small, unthreatening, open. He offered his hand, palm up, a gesture without pressure or urgency, a simple, quiet invitation. No rush, no questions, just space. Banner moved forward, not with the bounding energy of a younger dog, but with the measured care of one who understands the fragility of fear. He didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't even wag his tail. Instead, he sat beside the girls, his body angled slightly toward them, ears half tilted, gaze level with their faces. His breathing, steady and audible, filled the air between them, a new anchor. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind moved around them, making the girl's hair flutter and the dry grass along the shoulder tremble. It was the blue-dressed girl who stepped closer, her small shoulders drawn up, every muscle tense. She didn't let go of her sister. She didn't take Tom's hand. But she looked straight at Banner, and in that look, Tom saw the faintest spark of recognition, the knowledge that this animal, too, had known something about pain and waiting. The yellow-dressed twin hiccuped once, so softly it might have been the wind, then pressed her face into her sister's shoulder. Neither girl cried out. There was no hysteria, no panicked clamor for rescue. Only the sort of quiet endurance that Tom recognized all too well, the strength to keep standing after the world had proven itself unreliable. Tom remained still, not closing the distance, letting the silence do its work. He knew, deep down, what it meant to be wary of help. To have learned, over time, that grown-ups could be just another kind of danger, that uniforms and badges didn't always mean safety. He could see that wisdom reflected in the wary tilt of their bodies, the way they leaned into each other, neither willing to move unless the other did. Banner stretched out, his chin dropping until it rested on the ground between the girl's bare feet. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, quietly, the blue-dressed girl reached down and touched the top of Banner's head, fingers hesitant, then firmer. The gesture was almost invisible in the dim light, but Tom saw the tension in her shoulders release just a little. Her sister followed, crouching next to Banner, both girls' hands buried in his thick fur. Banner stayed perfectly still, absorbing their uncertainty, giving back warmth. Tom watched, his throat tight, not daring to break the moment. He thought of how trust sometimes returned, not all at once, but in increments, measured out by breath and heartbeat, by the small things that survived after everything else had failed. The girl's attention remained fixed on Banner. Tom let it happen. Let the dog do the work he could not. Slowly, Tom shifted from his knee to a seated position, legs folded beneath him on the shoulder of the road. He didn't speak. He simply waited, hands open, as the last bit of sun vanished behind the distant pines and the world shrank to a pool of lamplight, 2 girls and a dog. When at last the blue-dressed girl looked up, she met Tom's gaze, eyes searching his face as if trying to decide which version of an adult she was seeing. She didn't speak, but her chin lifted. It was enough. Behind them, a lone car passed far down the highway, headlights cutting briefly through the dusk. No one paid it any mind. The air was filled with the sounds of breathing, the rustle of fabric, the faint scratch of Banner's claws as he shifted to better shield the girls from the wind. Tom's thoughts drifted to his own childhood, to a night when he too had stood outside in the dark, waiting for someone to prove themselves trustworthy. He wondered if the girls could sense the ache in his bones, the ways he was patched together, not by heroism, but by a lifetime of disappointments survived. He waited, patient as stone, until the girls finally let Banner lead them from the center of the road to the safety of the grassy verge. Tom followed, keeping his distance. They were no longer quite so alone, and the world, for one fragile moment, felt just a little less cold. The girls' feet led them, guided by Banner's slow patience, to the slender edge where the road dissolved into brown grass and tangled brush. There, in the hush that follows the breaking of trust, lay the woman who had brought them this far, a shape at first, then a person, then a history made visible in the dusk. She was crumpled on her side, as if the earth itself had set her down, not harshly, but with a tired hand. Her hair, the same pale gold as her daughter's, had slipped from its tie and spilled over her face in a frail veil. One arm stretched outward, palm open to the cold, while the other curled under her thin torso as if still seeking comfort. Her blouse, a gentle green, worn soft, was torn at the shoulder, exposing a splay of fading bruises and the trembling, shallow rise and fall of her chest. The twins froze, each clinging to Banner's flank, shoulders hunched not in fear, but in the expectation of disappointment. Tom paused a step behind, kneeling to the ground again, feeling the familiar bite in his leg. He didn't rush. He let the quiet fill the space, honoring what had come before, whatever that had been. He knew the look of someone who had run out of places to run. Banner moved first, nosing forward on careful paws, each step deliberate. He lowered his head beside the woman's outstretched hand, sniffing along the length of her fingers, then pausing to rest his chin on the fragile bones of her wrist. He did not whine. He did not urge her up. He simply waited, breathing his own steady comfort into her stillness. Tom watched the dog and saw an echo of himself, someone who had been trained to react, to fix, to chase, but who had learned, sometimes, the only mercy was to witness, to be present and quiet. He drew in a breath, the chill filling his lungs, then reached forward, pressing 2 fingers to the woman's neck just below her jaw. The pulse was there, thin, skittering, but alive. Relief and worry twisted together in his chest. He shed his jacket and knelt, draping it gently across her torso. Banner shifted aside only enough to make space, eyes fixed on Tom's face as if asking permission to stay. Tom nodded once, a silent agreement between old friends. The girls stood a few paces back, not speaking, not daring to hope. Their faces held an exhaustion older than their years, dark rings under their eyes, lips chapped, cheeks streaked with dust and old tears. They watched as Tom checked their mother's breathing, adjusted her limbs to keep her warm, tucked her hand back beneath the jacket. He moved slowly, his actions careful, almost reverent, never breaking the hush with unnecessary words. Banner remained at the mother's side, pressed close enough that his warmth might reach her through layers of cloth and memory. He shifted now and then, adjusting his body so that his head rested against her ribs, the way he'd been trained once, long ago, to comfort those found after storms and fires. He offered no miracle, only presence, a body and a heartbeat, refusing to abandon the wounded. Tom sat back on his heels, gaze traveling from the mother's pale brow to the stillness of her daughter's. He saw his own uncertainty reflected in them, the ache of not knowing if help would come, If this was safety or only another pause in a long chain of harms. He searched the scene for any sign of what had brought them here. Tire tracks in the grass, broken stems, a discarded scarf half buried in leaves. Nothing violent, only the evidence of a life dropped in flight. The light was draining from the sky, turning everything the color of bruised fruit. Tom reached for his scarf, a woolen thing his sister had sent him last winter, and gently wrapped it around the woman's neck and shoulders. The girls watched, not moving, their eyes flickering from Tom's hands to Banner's steady form, and finally to their mother's quiet face. They drew a little closer, almost despite themselves. He wanted to promise them something, anything, that their mother would be all right, that they were safe, that the cold wouldn't last. But Tom had learned the danger of promises. Instead, he looked at them, letting the silence say what words could not. I'm here. I see you. I'm not going to rush you or your sorrow. A crow called once from a nearby branch, then was silent again. Banner shifted, licking the woman's wrist with the slow, deliberate care of a dog who has seen enough endings to know patience is its own form of hope. The younger girl, after a long, shaking breath, took a step closer and knelt, her small hand finding Banner's thick fur and holding tight. Her sister followed, mirroring the gesture, both of them grounding themselves against the warm certainty of the animal between them and the world. Tom's hands rested in his lap. His eyes swept the scene, a tableau of harm and hope, of things left unsaid, and the possibility, however faint, that tonight might mark a turning. He listened to the wind. He watched for movement. Mostly he waited. Above them, the sky deepened from blue to indigo, stars peeking out one by one, as if to remind the living that darkness is never absolute. There is always, somewhere, the memory of light. In that gathering dusk, Tom Granger and Banner kept their vigil, not as heroes, not as rescuers, but as the kind of company that stays when others have gone. For a long time they did nothing more. It was enough. Evening settled with a deliberate patience, as if time itself had slowed out of respect for the fragile congregation gathered at the edge of Highway 7. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath while dusk crept down from the ridgelines, and the last colors faded from the treetops. In that hour, cold found every space left open, working its way under collars, slipping between fingers, biting at bare ankles and knees. The wind came steadily now, no longer playful but insistent, combing through the stubble fields, rattling loose twigs across the shoulder of the road. Tom Granger took stock of his small assembly, the mother, wrapped in his jacket and scarf, still unconscious but breathing. The two girls, huddled close together and closer still to Banner. Banner himself, stretched along the ground, massive and unmoving, his flank a barrier against the wind and the darkness gathering beyond. No one spoke. Words would have felt like an intrusion, as if naming this moment too soon might break whatever spell was holding the world together. He reached for the radio at his belt, pressing the call button with a practiced thumb. His voice, when it emerged, was quiet, shaped more by fatigue than urgency. Dispatch, this is 7 Bravo. I need emergency medical at my location, north shoulder of Highway 7, just past mile marker 18. Adult female, head trauma, 2 juveniles, uninjured but cold. Repeat, request immediate assistance. Over. The static that answered seemed almost louder than the words themselves. He waited for the clipped confirmation, then let the radio fall against his hip. He didn't bother with reassurances or explanations to the girls. Some things could not be hurried. He simply stood nearby, his presence a promise. I'm not leaving. Not yet. Not until you're ready. The older twin sat upright, chin lifted, her hands twisted tightly together in her lap. Tom watched as the younger one, shivering, pulled Banner's tail over her bare feet for warmth, burying her toes deep into the thick fur. Banner didn't move, accepting the small weight with the stoicism of an old soldier. He let his breath out slow and steady, a rhythm the girls unconsciously mirrored, drawing air through noses red from the wind, letting it go with a sigh that was almost relief. Time passed. Distantly, headlights winked and disappeared along the highway, but none slowed, none stopped. Winter Spring was not a place where people expected trouble in the open, and night in the countryside had a way of making everything invisible. Troubles, wounds, and small, silent gatherings of the nearly lost. Tom crouched beside the group, the ache in his leg sharp now, but bearable. He drew his coat tighter, watching the sky for signs of the ambulance, listening for the first echo of a siren. There was none. Only the wind, restless and insistent, tugging at loose strands of the girls' hair, making their dresses flutter like torn flags. He caught the older girl looking at him, a quick, searching glance, then away. Not distrustful, just measuring. She pressed her lips together, knuckles white as she reached for her sister's hand. The younger girl's shoulders shook, a tiny tremor working through her body, but she didn't let herself cry. Instead, she leaned harder into Banner, face half hidden in his thick ruff, drawing silent strength from the animal's solidity. Banner adjusted himself again, this time lowering his head into the little hollow between both girls. His eyes closed, but his ears flicked with every change in the wind, every far-off sound. To Tom, he looked less like a working dog and more like a guardian, something ancient, bred to shield the small and the afraid, even if all he had to offer was warmth and the steady beating of his heart. A single tear slipped down the younger girl's cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, careful not to let her sister see. The movement was so small, so practiced, that Tom felt his own breath catch in his chest. He recognized that discipline, the quiet decision to swallow sorrow rather than risk having it misunderstood. Minutes, then more minutes. Tom's radio crackled again. The ambulance, still 15 minutes out, caught behind a detour. He nodded once to himself, then moved to his patrol car. He opened the trunk, pulling out an old wool blanket and 2 battered army green ponchos left over from a time before anyone in Winter Spring had needed them. He offered them wordlessly, one to each girl. The older twin accepted hers with a slow nod, tucking it around her sister's shoulders first, before pulling it over her own. The blanket, once draped over Banner and the girls, turned the 4 of them into a single huddled mass, breathing together in the cold. Tom stood over them, his shadow stretching long across the empty road. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, alert for lights, for hope, for anything that might break the stillness. The wind whistled through the trees, but inside their little circle, a different kind of quiet held, one not born of fear, but of survival. A space where tears could fall without being seen, where children and dogs could learn, perhaps for the first time, that shelter can sometimes be found in the shape of another's body, in the hush between words. And so they waited. Tom, the girls, and Banner, breathing the same cold air, listening to the night close in around them, sharing, by accident or by grace, a single silent promise. We will not leave each other, not yet. The low hum of the approaching ambulance wound its way through the dark and the hush. At first only a rumor in the distance, then a certainty, then light and engine noise spilling into the rural quiet. Blue and red strobes flickered against the trunks of bare trees, dancing along the blacktop and catching in the puddles left by the last week's rain. But inside the small shelter, made by wool and poncho and animal warmth, the world contracted to only what could be felt and held. Tom rose stiffly as the paramedics parked, his knee locking for a moment before giving way. He pressed a hand to the small of his back, watching as two figures moved with calm, measured urgency, neither startled nor hurried, simply practiced. They brought a stretcher, the medical bag, blankets. They paused when they saw the scene. The woman wrapped in Tom's jacket, the girls pressed tight to Banner's broad side, the old dog's eyes following every movement with that steady, undemanding vigilance that marks a creature who has waited a long time for comfort to be possible. Tom stepped forward, his presence a kind of buffer. "She's breathing," he said, voice low, giving only what was needed. The medic, a tall woman with dark braids and a square jaw, knelt beside the mother, her hands gentle, precise, never intrusive. She checked vitals, murmured a few words to her partner. The second medic unfolded the stretcher, opened a packet of foil blanket, tucked it around the woman's shins. While the mother was tended, Tom drifted back to the girls. He crouched beside them, slow, mindful of his aching leg. "It's going to be all right," he said, but the words were less important than his tone. Soft, steady, the voice of someone who no longer promises what he cannot keep. The older girl regarded him for a long moment, her chin lifting just enough to meet his eyes, then looked down at Banner and brushed her fingers along the dog's ear. A kind of ritual. Banner, sensing movement, shifted so the younger twin could lean against his shoulder. The girl closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to hold still. Tom saw it. The flinch whenever anyone reached quickly, the way both children braced themselves when footsteps approached. He recognized in them a different sort of bruise, one that left no mark, but shaped everything about how a person learned to carry themselves through the world. The medics lifted the mother onto the stretcher. There was no commotion, no panic. Only a series of practiced gestures, fastening straps, tucking blankets, noting details with a quiet nod. As they wheeled her toward the open ambulance doors, the younger girl hesitated, her breath stalling in her chest. She didn't cry, didn't call out, just watched, lips trembling. Banner stood, shook himself, and gently nudged the back of her hand with his nose. The touch was feather-light, patient. The older twin stepped to her sister's side, arms folding protectively around her shoulders. One of the medics, seeing the children's fear, paused. She knelt, leveled her eyes with theirs, and held out a blanket, soft, hospital green, already warm from the rig. The older girl took it, wrapping it around her sister first, then herself, a practiced choreography. The medic placed a gentle hand on the older girl's arm for a second, long enough to say, "You matter," but not so long as to unsettle her. Banner stayed close. He nosed at the blanket, then sat, a sentinel made of fur and silent assurance. Tom handed the older girl a half-crushed package of crackers from his coat pocket. She accepted with a careful nod, dividing it evenly. They ate in silence, the act almost ceremonial. As the ambulance prepared to leave, Tom carried the girls, one at a time with the kind of care that does not draw attention to itself, into the back seat of his patrol car. He placed Banner between them, the old dog settling his bulk across the seat with the gravity of a mountain, anchoring the small bodies pressed on either side. He watched the way they leaned in, trusting the animal with a closeness they withheld from the world. Tom returned to the roadside for a moment, letting the night air fill his lungs, the cool a sharp relief after the closeness of the rescue. He looked up. There were stars above now, crisp and cold, not yet dimmed by town lights. He stood beside his patrol car, resting a hand on the hood, watching the taillights of the ambulance retreat into the darkness. It struck him how each of them, mother, children, dog, himself, carried wounds unseen, stories hidden under skin and silence, revealed only in the small hesitations, the ways they held themselves or reached for comfort. Back inside the car, Banner had lain his head in the older girl's lap. She stroked his fur with slow, deliberate care, her fingers combing out tangles as if returning order to her own world. The younger girl had curled against his flank, already drifting toward the first true rest she'd found in days. Tom pulled out his own small reserve of patience. He drove slow, headlights slicing through fog, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the seat beside him, open in case anyone needed to reach. At a red light, he glanced at the rearview mirror. Two sets of eyes half closed, one dog breathing slow, a hush inside the car that felt less like waiting and more like release. When they reached the station, Tom carried the girls inside, one at a time, their bodies light and rigid, neither fully awake nor fully trusting. Banner followed, head low, gait slow but unbroken. Tom laid a thin blanket on the battered old couch in the station's break room and let the girls climb under, Banner curling beside them, a living wall against the dark. He turned off the overhead lights, leaving only the amber pool of a desk lamp to keep night at bay. Tom sat at his desk a few feet away, turning his battered patrol hat in his hands, eyes drifting to the trio asleep together. He felt the weight of exhaustion, not just of the day, but of years, of all the times he'd wondered if showing up quietly and without glory could ever be enough. He watched as Banner's ear flicked, as the older girl's hand tightened in the dog's fur, and as the world outside fell away. It wasn't healing, not yet, but in the hush that lingered, Tom let himself hope that wounds, no matter how well hidden, could be witnessed, and perhaps in time, eased by the warmth of shared breath, the comfort of presence, and the simple, stubborn act of not turning away. The station was quiet that night, emptier somehow than even its handful of rooms and flickering lights could explain. The dispatch desk stood abandoned, its radio squelch set low, a ghostly hum beneath the thrum of fluorescent bulbs. On the far wall, the town's old clock ticked in careful intervals, marking time in a place where little changed, and almost nothing was ever urgent after sundown. Tom Granger guided the girls through the side door, the smaller one still wrapped in the blanket from the ambulance, the older clutching the collar of Banner's neck. Their shoes had vanished somewhere between field and road, so Tom carried them one at a time down the cold linoleum hallway, letting Banner's steady paws set the pace. The girls said nothing, but their small, tired hands reached for the familiar warmth of the dog's fur, as if the animal's presence was the only bridge left between their world and anyone else's. Tom led them into the old break room, a narrow space tucked away at the back of the building, lined with faded cabinets and a single, battered table flanked by two metal chairs. He found a threadbare rug and set it by the old radiator, which wheezed and sputtered in the corner, coughing up just enough heat to keep the chill at bay. Banner circled twice, then dropped with a heavy sigh, chin on paws, his flank an invitation. The girls sank to the rug, curling into the dog's warmth with the instinct of creatures seeking shelter. Tom watched for a moment from the doorway, his hand lingering on the light switch, unsure whether to keep the overheads on or trust the soft golden pool of the desk lamp. He left it dim, the light falling in gentle halos across the rug and the children's hair, illuminating only what needed to be seen. In the kitchen alcove, Tom filled the kettle with water, turning the old tap as slow as the pipes would allow. He found 2 chipped mugs in the cabinet, one with the faded logo of the Winter Spring Fire Department, the other blank and blue. He emptied a packet of cocoa mix into each, added the steaming water, and stirred until the powder vanished. The smell, rich, sweet, almost like home, drifted into the main room. He set the mugs on the low table near the rug, not saying a word, just placing them within easy reach. The older girl's eyes flicked up, cautious and measuring, but she made no move toward the drink. The younger twin, half asleep already, pressed her cheek against Banner's back. Tiny fingers splayed over the dog's ribs. Banner shifted to accommodate her, letting his breath rise and fall with the slow patience of something rooted in earth. Tom knelt beside them, close enough for his presence to register, but not so near as to intrude. He tucked the blanket tighter around their shoulders, smoothing it over their knees, then stood and moved away, trusting them to the animal's care. The hours slipped by, measured only by the clock and the deepening dark outside the frosted windows. Tom sat at the desk, turning the day over in his mind, each memory a stone thrown into water. The hush of the highway, the pale faces of the girls, the mother's stillness, the steady patience of Banner's gaze. He thought of his own childhood, nights spent waiting for someone to come home, the quiet terror of being left, the relief that came in the shape of a neighbor's borrowed coat or a stranger's gentle touch. From his seat, he watched the girls, how they clung not to each other, but to Banner, how the older girl kept her eyes on the door, as if half expecting another intrusion, another round of questions or judgment. Tom understood the language of silence. He respected it. He let the minutes drift by, content to be nothing more than a quiet witness to whatever healing might take place in the hush. Banner remained awake long after the girls drifted into the fitful, restless sleep of the newly safe. His ears twitched with every unfamiliar sound. A truck rattling past on the main road, the sigh of the building settling, the distant clatter of pipes behind the wall. Once the older girl woke with a start, a sharp gasp tearing from her throat, but Banner's head was already there, nudging her hand, grounding her back in the here and now. She didn't cry out. She only let her fingers twist into his fur, letting the simple act of touch carry her back to quiet. Tom checked on them from time to time, bringing another blanket, adjusting the lamp. He kept his own presence understated, his footsteps soft, his voice lower than the wind outside. At midnight, he brewed himself a weak cup of instant coffee and sat with the station's logbook, making neat, careful notes about the night's events. His handwriting was steady, each word a small promise not to forget the details. 2 girls, mother injured, Banner present, no further incident. Outside, frost crept up the lower panes of glass, tracing fern-like patterns on the blackness. The radiator clanked and groaned, the pipes gurgling as if muttering secrets to themselves. The older girl lay awake, watching shadows climb the far wall. Banner's breathing never faltered. The station, always so full of the business of law and order, became, in that slow, unhurried night, a kind of sanctuary. Near dawn, Tom sat with his hat in his lap, elbows on knees, chin resting on knuckles. He thought about his own scars, the ones people could see, and the deeper ones that were never spoken of. He thought of Banner's long journey, from K-9 hero to companion to keeper of lost children. He wondered if the girls, in their sleep, dreamed of somewhere warmer, somewhere safer, a place where morning could arrive without fear. When at last the first gray light seeped in around the window trim, Tom saw the older girl sitting up, silent but not afraid, her hand moving slowly across Banner's chest. The younger was still curled against the dog's belly, breath coming soft and even. Tom didn't speak. He didn't have to. For now, in this small, imperfect place, everyone had survived the night. Sometimes, he thought, that was the first step to anything better. Dawn came quietly to Winter Spring, a pale gray leaking through the station's frosted windows. The world outside was motionless. No birds yet, only the faint hissing of the wind against the glass, a hush that seemed to seep into every corner. Inside the break room, Banner lifted his head as the light shifted. The girls were still, wrapped in blankets, faces soft with the exhaustion that follows survival. Tom Granger moved quietly, his boots padding the linoleum, careful not to startle anyone awake. He poured water for himself, drank slowly, letting the chill bite at his throat. He glanced at the clock on the wall, just past 6. Another day, another chance to try, he thought, and not for the first time wondered what that might mean for any of them. The girls stirred. The older one blinked at the unfamiliar ceiling before her gaze found Banner's calm eyes. Only then did she push herself upright, blanket slipping from her shoulders. The younger followed, nestling her chin on the dog's side, blinking in the weak light. Tom entered with a quiet smile not too broad. "Morning," he said, his voice almost as soft as the hush outside. The girls didn't answer, but neither did they flinch. Banner rose and stretched, the old dog's joints popping with effort, before nosing both girls in a small, silent greeting. It was the kind of gesture that required no trust, only the promise that he would remain until asked to leave. Breakfast was plain: 2 slices of toast, a little jam, 2 mugs of warm cocoa, and 1 for Tom. The girls ate slowly, fingers wrapped tight around the mugs for warmth. Tom watched them with the gentle attention of someone who had learned to give space without withdrawing. He let the silence fill the room. Sometimes silence was the most faithful witness. When the girls were ready, Tom led them out to the car. The November morning stung at their faces, the ground stiff with frost, air clean and bracing. Banner moved ahead, his body a wall between the children and the wide world beyond the sidewalk. They drove in silence, past old houses shrouded in mist, lawns edged with frost, the pale gold of the last fallen leaves crunching under the tires. Tom parked by the edge of the woods, just off the highway where they'd found the family the night before. The police tape fluttered weakly in the wind. Someone else had come, walked the ground, set the markers. But for Tom and for Banner, there were always traces left behind that no badge or report could catalog. He left the car running, letting the heat linger, and walked with the girls and Banner to the shoulder. The earth was still muddy, the prints from last night faint but not erased. Tom knelt, bad legs stiff, scanning the ground for anything missed in the chaos. Patterns in the leaves, broken grass, things dropped in haste or fear. Banner moved ahead, nose close to the earth, every motion deliberate. Near the ditch, a scrap of blue caught Tom's eye. He reached for it gently, careful not to tear it further. A knitted scarf, handmade, a pale yarn tangled with leaves and burrs. He shook it out. The older girl made a soft sound, a stifled gasp. Tom didn't press, only offered the scarf to her, holding it out until she was ready. She took it, clutching the wool tight to her chest. A few steps farther, Banner paused, head lowered, tail stiff. He pawed at the ground, revealing a battered school notebook, its cover smeared with mud and streaked with the pinks and blues of childish doodles. Tom wiped it clean as best he could and opened to a page near the middle. writing in a wobbly hand. Names, perhaps, a list of things to remember. He closed the book and handed it to the younger girl, who pressed it to her lap and traced her fingers along the edge. Tom knelt by a set of tire tracks at the edge of the clearing. The ground here was churned, heavy tread marks angling off the road and into the deeper trees. He measured them with his eye. Not a local vehicle, not with that size, that pattern. Banner circled each mark, sniffed carefully, then sat back, gaze fixed on Tom as if to say, "There's something here you need to see." He took a few pictures, making mental notes. There was nothing urgent about his movements, no rush to solve or explain. Tom knew that some truths, the kind that mattered most, revealed themselves only in stillness, in the act of paying attention. He looked at the girls, not for answers, but to witness what was surfacing behind their eyes. The older girl was stroking the scarf, lost in thought. Her face softened in a way that spoke not of relief, but of a memory retrieved, a piece of home found in the debris. Banner led them deeper along the tree line, pausing at every hint of scent, every bend of grass. They found more evidence of a hurried departure. A glove, small and faded. A silver button snapped from a child's coat. A crushed juice box, its straw still in place. Each item was shown to the girls, never forced, only offered. And sometimes the answer was a nod, sometimes nothing at all. Tom marked everything, each artifact a small step toward understanding what had happened, and how these children had learned so early to read the signs of safety or threat. They worked in silence, a choreography of movement, Banner circling, Tom watching, the girls gathering the fragments of their story, bit by bit. There was no fear now, only the slow, gentle work of reclaiming what could be saved from a night spent in hiding. When the search ended, Tom led them back to the car. The girls climbed in, arms full of the things they'd found. Banner leapt into the back seat, letting the girls lean against him, their eyes heavier now, a sleepiness born not just of fatigue, but of the peace that comes when something lost is found again. Tom drove them away from the woods, from the clearing, into the growing light of morning. There were answers left unspoken, questions still to come. But for now, it was enough to gather what remained, to witness the fragments of truth, and to walk slowly, gently, toward something like healing. The hospital's corridors glowed with that particular kind of brightness meant to soothe, yet rarely succeeded. Floors waxed to a high polish. Walls painted the color of warm milk. Everything hushed except for the distant chime of an elevator and the muffled steps of nurses on night rounds. Tom Granger led the way through these pale, quiet halls, the girls trailing close, their arms laden with the scarf and the battered notebook, the day's small recoveries. Banner moved with them, not so much walking as flowing, his presence a current guiding the girls forward, slowing only to nudge them gently away from passing carts or to wait, steadfast, at each threshold. The children's mother lay in a narrow bed in a private room at the end of the ward, surrounded by the machinery of vigilance. IV lines, heart monitor, a plastic clip on her finger glowing red in the dim. Her face was pale and slack in sleep, mouth parted slightly, hair brushed back but still wild at the edges. An open window let in the faintest November chill, enough to stir the curtains and ripple the air. There was no scent of flowers, only antiseptic, laundry soap, and a trace of the earth the girls carried in their hair and clothes. When Tom ushered them inside, he lingered near the door, one hand resting on the glass, unwilling to intrude. The girls went forward slowly, uncertainty etched in every step. Clutching their treasures to their chests, they stood at their mother's bedside for a long, silent moment. No sound but the steady beep of the monitor, the click of the heating vent, and Banner's gentle breathing as he waited by the door. It was the older twin who reached out first, placing her hand softly over her mother's. The mother did not wake, but she sighed, a small, fluttering breath, and turned her head just enough that her cheek brushed the back of her daughter's hand. The girls watched her intently, looking for a sign that it was all right to hope. Banner padded to the edge of the bed, resting his head on the thin mattress, eyes trained on the woman, as if willing her to feel the warmth he brought into the room. Tom stood by, hat in his hands, struck by how healing never happened all at once. It came in increments, a touch, a breath, a moment spent in the company of those who would not leave. He watched as the younger girl settled onto the visitor's chair, clutching the notebook. Her feet not touching the floor, the older followed, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hand still holding her mother's. Banner stayed between them, a living link binding all three to the present. A nurse entered, moving quietly, her shoes barely whispering against the tile. She was older, silver hair coiled tight, eyes warm but not prying. She paused at the door, reading the scene before her, then placed a small vase of wild asters on the bedside table. The flowers looked almost out of place in their beauty, their stems tangled, petals slightly battered by wind, but their presence transformed the air, reminding anyone who saw them that kindness could arrive unexpected, unasked. The nurse checked the monitors, adjusted the blanket, and with a nod to Tom, slipped out as quietly as she'd come. Tom caught her eye just before she left, a look that said, "Thank you," without the weight of words. The nurse answered with a small smile, understanding in the way of those who have carried more than their share of suffering and survived it. Outside the window, a flock of starlings wheeled through the pale sky, dipping and rising as one body. Tom watched them, feeling the way the world could knit itself together if only given time and patience. He stepped closer to the glass, gaze shifting between the birds and the small, quiet drama unfolding in the hospital room. Minutes passed. The younger girl, too tired to resist, curled on the chair, knees tucked under her chin, the scarf held close to her cheek. The older, refusing to sleep, simply sat and watched her mother's breathing, her hand never leaving the older woman's. Banner lay curled on the cool floor, head lifted, eyes half closed in the contentment of a guardian whose job, for the moment, was to bear witness. Tom felt the familiar ache in his leg and found a chair along the far wall, settling himself into its creaking embrace. He let the exhaustion wash through him, not fighting it, but letting it soften the edges of his vigilance. He watched as the shadows moved across the room, the afternoon light slipping into evening. In that stillness, something subtle shifted. The mother, rousing just enough, squeezed her daughter's hand in return. The older girl's eyes widened, not a word spoken, but a rush of hope so sudden and bright it seemed to fill the room. Banner thumped his tail once, soft and slow, as if echoing the joy none of them dared express aloud. No one announced the moment. No one broke the hush with clumsy celebration. Instead, the healing wove itself quietly, in glances, in breath, in the way the room warmed with each small act of care. Tom let himself close his eyes for a moment, listening to the life gathering in the room, the gentle rhythm of hearts beginning, at last, to trust the possibility of return. Outside, dusk deepened. The world held its breath and let it go at last. The first true cold came quietly, one night in early December, coating the roofs and lawns of winter spring in a thin, shimmering frost. By morning, the last of the autumn leaves were scattered and wind-tossed, leaving bare branches etched against a sky the color of unwashed linen. The world outside felt distant, hushed, suspended. Yet inside the rented house at the edge of town, life began, almost without warning, to settle itself into a gentle, careful rhythm. The new home was modest, walls a bit thin against the cold, floors creaking in the hallways, windows trimmed with old lace curtains. But it was theirs, the girls', still waking from nightmares some nights, had come to measure safety not in locks or alarms, but in the consistency of small rituals, the smell of baking, the click of the heater at dawn, and Banner's heavy steps across the kitchen floor. On Saturdays, Tom would arrive just after lunch, his arms full, sometimes a sack of groceries, sometimes a potted fern or a spool of yarn he'd picked up at the thrift store. He knocked gently, waiting for the sound of running feet and the clatter of paws behind the door. The mother would answer with a tired, genuine smile, her limp less pronounced each week, her eyes a little brighter, as if the shadows of the hospital had faded just enough to let the light back in. Banner always entered first, tail swinging low, nose busy at the girl's outstretched hands. He'd drop a forgotten scarf or the stray elastic hair tie he'd discovered under the couch, delivering each item with the solemnity of a gift bearer. The girls would laugh, a small, honest sound, and crouch beside him to inspect the treasure, the elder always making sure her sister got first pick. In the kitchen, the mother guided her daughters through the careful alchemy of baking, flour clouding the air, eggs cracked into bowls, the sweet, dense aroma of cookies rising as the oven warmed the room. Banner lay stretched across the rug by the stove, one ear flicking whenever the timer beeped, his eyes tracking every movement, as if memorizing each new routine. Tom would help where he could, mending a loose step on the porch, fixing the squeak in the bathroom door, sweeping the last leaves from the walkway. Sometimes he'd sit at the table, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, listening to the hum of domestic life. He moved quietly through their days, never taking up too much space but never retreating either. Afternoons, when the work was done, Tom would walk the girls and Banner through the small garden behind the house, now edged with frost. The grass had faded to a brittle gold, but a few stubborn pansies pressed color up from the soil. The girls would chase each other down the narrow paths, giggling when Banner nosed at their mittens or tossed his head to catch a low-flying leaf. On these walks, Tom would sometimes spot a forgotten glove or a threadbare scarf, stooping to collect it and hand it back to the nearest small hand. The girls never lost their gratitude for these returned things, their thanks spoken more in shy glances than words. The older girl once pressed a faded hair ribbon into Tom's palm, a quiet acknowledgement of the ways he'd helped stitch their lives back together. There was a peace in these days that neither girl had known before. In the quiet afternoons, the sisters would sit on the living room rug, painting and drawing, Banner curled beside them, his great head resting on crossed paws, the house filled with the faint sound of radio music and the slow, soft patter of rain against the windows. Tom and the mother would talk sometimes, their words meandering and slow, about old winters, favorite books, the quirks of small-town life. Sometimes there was no need for talk at all, just the comfort of shared company as the dusk deepened outside. Evenings brought a hush that felt different from the silence of fear. The girls would sit with their mother beside the fire, Banner dozing between them, his body a warm, breathing pillow. Tom might read aloud, a chapter from a children's book or sometimes the newspaper, his voice gentle and low. The mother would knit or mend, her hands steady, the girls watching, learning, their shoulders relaxing inch by inch as the world taught them it could be gentle after all. Winter crept closer, each morning colder than the last. The windows frosted over in elaborate spirals, and the girls would press their fingers against the glass, tracing patterns, laughing when Banner's nose left a foggy print beside theirs. The mother planted paperwhites in a shallow dish, their green shoots a promise that spring, eventually, would come. The days were not perfect. There were still bad dreams, still moments when the girls flinched at sudden sounds or needed to find Banner in the night, pressing close to the warmth of his fur. But there was healing in the repetition of kindness, in the small duties of living, in the return of joy so gentle it might be missed by anyone not looking closely. In all this, Banner remained constant, a presence, a witness, a source of comfort too deep for words, and Tom, moving through the days with quiet steadfastness, found his own wounds eased, little by little, by the simple work of belonging. The home, once just a shelter from the cold, became a place where hope could settle, stubborn and persistent, among the echoes of laughter, the warmth of the oven, and the softness of Banner's sigh as evening settled over them all. The first snow arrived overnight, blanketing winter spring in a hush so complete it felt as though the town itself was holding its breath. In the gray light of early morning, the rooftops and fences wore a soft white cap, and the tree branches glimmered with frost, each twig outlined in silent celebration. Inside the little house, warmth gathered itself in every corner. The soft glow of lamps, the hum of the heater, and the mingled smells of coffee, cocoa, and wood smoke. Tom arrived before sunrise, brushing the snow from his coat as he stepped onto the porch, a brown paper bag balanced on his hip, and a shy, hopeful feeling in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. The windows glowed amber from within, and when the mother opened the door, her smile was a quiet invitation, her eyes less wary than they had been for so many weeks. Banner greeted Tom first, a gentle nudge of the nose, his tail sweeping the floor in a steady rhythm. The girls tumbled into the entryway, their cheeks pink with excitement, pajamas still warm from bed. They helped Tom with his boots and the bag, their chatter low and content, voices rising only when Banner spun in a slow circle, inviting them all into the familiar comfort of the kitchen. Breakfast was simple, a pan of cinnamon rolls, mugs of hot chocolate, a dish of scrambled eggs for Banner, who accepted his share with all the dignity of an elder statesman. The kitchen was crowded, elbows bumping, hands passing plates and forks. The girls giggled when Tom fumbled a spoon, and their mother shook her head with a smile, easing into the rhythm of domestic clatter. Banner lay under the table, head on his paws, his eyes tracking every movement. Later, while the girls bundled themselves in sweaters and thick socks, Tom helped string a line of small gold lights along the porch railing. The air outside was cold and sweet, the snow crunching underfoot, and each bulb glowed like a promise against the pale sky. Inside, the girls pressed their faces to the windows, their breath fogging the glass, while Banner paced between the front door and the kitchen, ears alert to the comings and goings of his people. By afternoon, the world had grown even quieter, the sky brightening to the blue of a new penny. The mother sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her gaze soft as she watched the girls build a lopsided snowman just beyond the porch. Tom joined her, his own mug cradled in his palms, the silence between them easy. Sometimes their talk drifted to the past, old scars, lost places, but more often, it lingered on the present. How the girls had grown steadier, how Banner's coat gleamed, how the house itself seemed to have settled around them. Banner, ever patient, watched the girls from the threshold, His breath clouding the air, the older girl called him outside, her mittened hands beckoning. Banner stepped into the snow, slow and stately, allowing himself to be crowned with a scarf, and offered the place of honor beside their snowy creation. The younger twin pressed a small pine cone into his paw, giggling as Banner accepted it, grave and grateful. There was no hurry, no need to capture the moment. Just the sound of laughter mingling with the soft hush of falling snow. Evening came early. The lights on the porch flickered to life, casting golden halos on the snowdrifts. Inside, the family gathered for dinner at the small, scarred table. 2 girls, their mother Tom, and Banner curled at their feet. The meal was plain: soup and bread, fruit and cheese, cookies saved from the morning's baking. No one spoke much. There was comfort in the clink of spoons, the shared passing of plates, the little rituals that had grown up quietly between them. Afterward, they lingered together in the living room, watching as snow fell thick and soft outside the window. The girls sat curled on the couch, leaning against Banner, who stretched contentedly across the rug, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. Their mother read aloud from a storybook, her voice low and musical, the words tumbling like snowflakes through the room. Tom sat nearby, hands folded in his lap, the gentle ache in his leg forgotten for a while. He looked at each face, the mother stronger now, the girls, their eyes bright, Banner dozing, a soft rumble in his chest, and felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. It was not a feeling that called for speech or for grand gestures, only for gratitude, that they were here, that they had made it through. Near the hearth, a small hook held Banner's old collar. Beside the polished tag that read simply Banner, there now hung another, smaller tag, stamped with one word: home. Before bed, they all stood together by the front door, watching the snow. The world outside was quiet and endless, the street lamps blurring the falling flakes to gold. Banner pressed close to Tom's side, the girls on either side of him, their mother's arm resting gently around Tom's shoulders. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. In the hush, they watched as winter covered the earth in white, as if blessing the house and those within with peace and the soft, sturdy promise of belonging. Somewhere in the darkness, a neighbor's dog barked. Banner lifted his head, listening, then settled back with a sigh, content. The family, imperfect, healing, quietly knit together by trouble and tenderness, stood together in the golden pool of lamplight, watching the quiet, and found, in that stillness, a sense of home. In the hush of an early winter night, sometimes all it takes is the weight of a loyal dog's head, or the warmth of hands held across a battered kitchen table, to remind us healing is slow, imperfect, and real. It's found in the way we show up for each other, quietly, when no one else does. Not every wound leaves a scar you can see, but every kindness, however small, leaves a mark, sometimes enough to start again. If this story touched something silent in you, I hope you'll share a moment below, a memory, a hope, or simply that you too have seen the power of gentleness to change a life. Let's gather here quietly, as people who know what it means to lose and still choose to care. Thank you for listening, for feeling, for believing with me that there is always a way home.